online.
Give folks a couple more minutes. I'll see if I'm connecting to audio.
Hey, good morning.
Hey, good morning, Alexis.
And sorry, I got to jump at 9:30, so I'm just going to be here for the first bit, but just here to listen. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
All right, it looks like we're here. Angie, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to see you all. I was just talking with our project manager team about how it's hard to believe today is our fifth and final work group meeting. It's been it's been a bit of a slog, but I think we've done a lot of really good work over the last year together. So I just want to start by saying thank you. The level of participation from the members of this work group, I think, have been commendable. The expertise that you all bring to the table and your willingness to be vulnerable together and try to get to the root of some of these issues and conversations, I think has just been excellent the whole way from start to finish. And I participate in a couple of other rulemaking committees for DLCD, and this is not rulemaking, but it's similar in some ways. And I just have to extend a personal thank you for your consistent levels of participation. Sometimes work group members drop off or they, become distracted with other tasks. And I think y'all show up every time, and you provide excellent feedback in writing and verbally in the work group conversations. And I'm just so proud of the work we've done together and excited to dig into the final report with you all today. And think, at the end of this conversation, we should all leave feeling really good about where we're at and where this is heading. And I'm excited for the next chapter. So I'll just stop there and turn it over to Cadence and Leanne to help us get into the meat of it today. But I look forward to the conversation. And again, just thank you very much for all the work that's gotten us to where we are today.
Thanks, Angie. Yes, to all of what you just said. To all of you on the work group, thank you so much for what you did. And we're gonna, you're not done yet. It's gonna be a long couple hours where we talk through some of the details and try and dive in and resolve some questions, and make sure we haven't missed anything. We're really eager for today's conversation. As you have seen from the agenda, we're going to start with kind of going into a deep dive on some loose ends because we want to make sure we get everything just right. Some of you, your eyes might gloss over and not want to deal with the nuance. Some of you might be really, really into the exact language and details, and all of that is okay. We will try to make this as painless as possible. But I think I'll turn it over to Leanne to get us started with that before we move into a discussion about the priority recommendations.
Thank you, Cadence. So yeah, first we'll start with sort of the loose ends, and this is going to be a little bit technical, but stay with us because the other parts are going to be more entertaining and engaging. So we'll kind of run through just some loose ends that we had as a consultant team and with DLCD that we just wanted the experts in the room to finally weigh in on and kind of agree on a couple things for the recommendations. And then we'll have another discussion on priorities that Cadence will lead us through, and then we'll discuss the draft report and how we've done on meeting kind of the bill and also the expectations of this work group. And then we'll have work group reflections where we kind of hear from you all about how this process has gone. And then we'll have some final remarks from some folks in the room, and then we'll discuss any next steps we have. So we'll start with the loose ends. Um, all right. So at this point in the project, we're aware that we'll start with number one here. We're aware that some agencies and jurisdictions that we've been talking with throughout the process require a resident to reside in a home where childcare is provided. And there isn't a lot of uniformity on that playing out across Oregon. Sometimes it's licensing if you're a registered family childcare home. Sometimes it's a local land use regulation, and sometimes it's a building code requirement implemented locally. But during the report review, a few of you raised this as something that you'd like to hear BCD weigh on formally. In the form of it, just basically from the building code perspective, since we have some regulations that we can kind of specifically point to on the licensing and land use side, but less so on the building code side. We know that there was some discussion recently between BCD and some of the local jurisdictions about this, and we've had a back and forth about it yesterday over email. But for the benefit of the entire work group, we'd like to kind of discuss it in this forum. And I'd like to invite Tony, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit to provide a response to the question of whether the building code requires a resident to live in a dwelling where childcare is provided.
Sure. Yeah. Good morning. Thank you. Um, so no, there is no citable path to specify a resident. I think the important thing to note, kind of in this space, is that while this is still a dwelling use, this is the code specifically aligning with licensure intentionally to allow something that's not a typical dwelling function within this dwelling. So whatever licensure allows, that's what we align with. There's no citable path that I'm aware of to specify a resident or number of residents or any other thing that we would typically associate with a group R3 dwelling. So hopefully that makes sense and it's easy to follow. Happy to answer any follow-up questions. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be following up with Tony just to make sure we kind of get the technical aspect of it well documented in the report. But are there any questions? Oh, Kelly, got your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. I saw a comment in the chat that the sound was a little broken up, Tony's sound. So, and I had a clarifying question too, so maybe I can kind of repeat what he said and then ask one clarifying question. Tony shared that the building codes is aligned with licensure in allowing a use of a dwelling for something other than resident, typical, living in that space. And so there is no requirement in building code that that someone has to live in a home that is being used as a family childcare home. And Tony, I just want to clarify that when you say aligned with licensure, you're talking about DELC licensing for the family childcare home. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Is my audio okay? Is it coming through? It looks fine on my end. So yeah, that's correct. I mean, the intention here is to specifically align with whatever's allowed under licensure, under DELC licensure for these facilities. So there's not a path. We don't put any additional limitations, on these uses. That makes sense.
I'm just going to go in order I'm seeing it. Dana.
Thanks, Tony. This is really clarifying. Do you anticipate building codes putting out anything in writing or guidance to clarify this in addition to the comment here and the report?
Me too. I mean, my team, we provide informal interpretations all day, every day. So we've already provided this in writing to a local government partner. We're happy to provide it again in writing if we need to do something more formal. We're happy to do that. In my 13 plus years at the division, I've never seen it interpreted that a resident has to be present in the dwelling for this licensed facility, which the licensure determines what's appropriate in the licensed facility. There's no other. I mean, there's no path in code in the state building code. There hasn't been that I'm aware of. Hopefully that.
Alicia?
Good morning. I'm Alicia Gardner. I am the Childcare Licensing Division Director, and this is my first time joining this group. It's nice to see you all. I wanted to just clarify for you all that in registered family rules for childcare licensing, there is a requirement that you have to be a resident of the home. For certified family homes, this is where we do not have requirements related to residency in the home or not. And historically, CCLD has deferred to planning and zoning to make those determinations and not building code. So that is not something we've ever looked to building codes to determine for childcare licensing. Um, in addition, I will also just note that this third bullet related to updating childcare licensing rules for the types of dwellings in home childcare can occur may be difficult to do because CCLDs and DELC statutes do state that particularly for certified family care, that those licensed facilities may be licensed in a single family home dwelling or any other dwelling. So there is a law that does state that certified family childcare can be in any dwelling. So taking time to define in our rules the types of dwellings may conflict with our statutes. And so just wanted to let everybody know that that is not likely something that we could do in rulemaking without some sort of statutory alignment.
Yes, we're going to come back to that one in just a second. Anyone else? Brad, did you want to speak to the building code piece and the resident requirement?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got the same interpretation that Tony has as far as the way that code reads, but ultimately, building code sets that precedent for us. So I can relay that to our building official, and that's definitely the way we can call it, saying that they don't have to be a resident in there. So that's fine. I just recommended that we get a clarification on that because every building official can think differently if they want by reading that section, and it's not very clear. So yeah, if building codes wants us to call it that way, that's great.
Right. Well, any other thoughts on that before we move to the next one? Thank you, Tony. I am going to put you on the spot one more time, though. And then we'll let you go. We'll stay on, but we'll let you go from, being on the spot. Okay, so the other building code related item we'd like to clear up and make sure the work group is aware of are any potential amendments made to the building code that will take effect, I think, sometime in 2025, that potentially provide a clear path forward for allowing childcare to occur in multi-unit apartment buildings. Tony provided some helpful resources. We did our best as non-building code experts to try and identify what those amendments were, and weren't able to do so, but we were hoping today that we could put Tony on the spot and see if he could provide us with an overview of those amendments, and then we can follow up again on the sort of like technical documentation.
Sure. Yeah, great. So as part of the 2025 OSSC process, the committee process just wrapped up at the end of August, or actually in the middle of September, excuse me. And then the advisory board, the Building Code Structures Board that appointed that review committee, made their final recommendations to our administrator in October. And just as a reminder for folks, the way the state building code works is it takes an affirmative from the appropriate advisory board and an affirmative from our administrator in order for a code to become the code in Oregon. And so it takes two to tango. And what they approved through the committee process, there was some great work by committee member Jody Orison, for those of you that know Jody, from the city of Portland, to coordinate with someone from DELC, working on the language specifically with the dwelling term. And so what we did is we basically just added a line item under the group R2 uses that clarifies that if you have a childcare facility within a group R2, that it's just considered part of that primary occupancy, that you don't have to do anything special. And that's a little bit different than our 420.12 path, right, that we came up with DELC as a combined kind of solution for those that are located in detached dwellings, right? So that's something where we're talking about detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses. We have that 420.12 path. And that was that whole discussion about resident sprinkler systems, dwelling sprinklers back, previously. But now there's the path to not have sprinklers. It's been there for a couple of years now, the customer choice path, and that's just for the detached. So then now we have a clear path that says, okay, if you're in an apartment, let's say, that from the building code perspective, there's nothing else that you have to do. And how you treat it, you just treat it as part of the primary occupancy. We worked with senior staff at ICC as well and confirmed that even from their perspective, that they don't have anything. Their occupant loads are a little bit different, right? For care facilities within dwellings, they limit it nationally to that 5 or fewer threshold. We obviously do things differently here in Oregon. We align with licensure and whatever that statutory allowance is. But they didn't have any other perspective than what we have, which is clearly that if you have this care facility licensed and the licensure, again, permits it to be located within an apartment dwelling, then we wouldn't have any other further limitations on that. Hopefully that helps.
Trying to look at the chat. Any questions on that?
When we're talking about a childcare facility that can be licensed and included with no additional requirements inside a multifamily apartment, are we talking about registered and certified family, or are we also talking about certified center?
That's probably a question for Gallup. So again, we don't differentiate. It's whatever is licensed and permitted by the licensing authority. We don't get into that. State building codes that.
I would agree with Tony that certified centers can be licensed in residential spaces. However, there are additional requirements in the certified center rules related to fire marshal, environmental health, so they do get a little more complicated in a residential space. However, there are certified centers that are licensed in residential spaces across the state. It's not the traditional model that we usually see.
And if I can just jump back in, I might have misunderstood that a little bit. So if you're looking at like a center, like a group E or an I4, that's obviously something different. We're talking about the indwelling, care facilities. So it would be, with the licensure, I think they're registered and certified family child care homes that are permitted to be located in dwellings by licensure, again, within a dwelling. That is the specific terminology that that's looking at.
And one kind of innovative model I've heard people exploring is the idea of having one of the ground floor units with a different interior floor plan that allows that to meet the requirements for a certified family child care home, but somebody might not be living there. So I'm wanting to clarify, combining this with the previous recommendation that you could have up to 16 child serving certified family and in one of the ground floor units, and no one would necessarily have to live there.
So I can address the second part. The licensure determines how many kids, right, and what is allowed in their licensed facilities and where those licensed facilities can be located. So from the building code side, though, no, we don't require any residents. When these uses are very specific, the code is saying, okay, in this dwelling, you're allowed to now use this dwelling for something different than a dwelling. You're now allowed to use it for this other use as a business as well, right? And so you have this other use that's permitted in this dwelling. And so that's what's permitted. There's no citable path that I'm aware of, even going back to UBC days, for anything to be cited for a single resident or a resident or one resident or a permanent resident. Never seen that language. Hopefully that helps.
All right. I think we have enough to kind of wrap up our documentation in the report. Is there anything, DLCD, any clarifying questions? Nope. Okay. All right, well, we'll move along. Alicia, you started to touch on this one, but I want to come back to it for other folks. So one of our current recommendations is to update childcare licensing rules for where in-home childcare can occur to better align with the building code terminology. So this recommendation is really focused on ensuring that there's alignment between the types of structures the two agencies are allowing childcare to occur in. So there aren't any kind of unintentional hangups or limitations on the dwelling front. But it was raised during this process that there could be some unintended consequences for making this change on Delk's side. So before we finalize the recommendations, we want to make sure that we've discussed those as a group, and sort of enlighten, Echo Northwest, especially to any kind of things that we might be blind to. So we have proposed a slight change in language here, and it's on the slide to help kind of clear up any confusion around the intent of the recommendation, but we need to kind of understand, the implications. So we're proposing to update it to say update childcare licensing rules for the types of dwellings in-home childcare can occur in to better align with building code terminology. So Alicia, if you want to kind of make your point, we can get into that discussion. And any other folks, please weigh in as well.
Yeah, I apologize for jumping ahead. But I will just repeat again, like our statute is pretty clear that it says any other dwelling. And so unless if we were differentiating every type of dwelling, I don't believe it would be an easy path for us to put into rule the types of dwellings that are allowed because the statute does not state the types of dwellings. It states any dwelling. And so for that purpose, I think it would be difficult for unilateral like rule update. It would have to probably be looked at in the statute.
Yes, and I am referring to the administrative rules that specify, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, that I think certified family has to be in a single family dwelling.
That's correct. Those rules are actually going for a vote at the Early Learning Council. CCLD is in the process of doing a major revision of the certified family home rules. And in that current draft for rule revision, it does align with the statute language, which states single family dwelling or any other dwelling.
Okay. And that seems like it would work totally fine with the building code then. Is that correct, Tony?
Yeah, yeah. So the way we've worded it, again, through the committee, and this will be in the next iteration of the OSSC, and if there's anybody, Brad, or anybody who wants to look at this language, I'm happy to send a draft out. We do this all the time. We share drafts all the time. Just contact me or one of my team members. Is that we said, okay, we're permitted by licensure to be located within a Group R2 dwelling, then there's nothing else required. And so the good thing about owning multifamily is that they're already going to have a sprinkler system. That discussion is a different discussion. So a bunch of other things are already handled on the multifamily space. And so then it would just be for the licensure requirements. Thank you.
And Alicia, when did you say that those updates will take effect?
I don't have the date off the top of my head. I think it is December 11th, but that will be the vote at the Early Learning Council meeting, which is a public meeting if anybody is interested in watching. And then after the vote, the rules are scheduled to go into effect July of 2025. However, this is already in statute, so this the law, right, overrides the rule, even if the rule is in effect or not updated. So this is already currently in effect. And so we're just working to update the rule language to match the law.
Okay. So DLCD, do we remove this recommendation then, or just kind of put a footnote in the report? As a work group, I kind of like to come to a decision about what to do about this recommendation.
I mean, DLCD can't really make that call for the work group. I think needing consensus of the work group as to whether or not we remove a strategy at this point would be important. I think maybe if we just ask right now, does anybody have any concerns about removing this so that, or at least adding the information that we've just discussed to the report to acknowledge that this has been addressed. This was a concern of the work group and it has been addressed in a variety of ways. Are there any strong feelings out there amongst the work group? I want to be careful that DLCD doesn't over navigate as we facilitate this work.
I would just add a footnote that it's been addressed. It was a concern, but it's been addressed and it's in play. It's being addressed.
Okay.
I would agree because it sounds like, well, it's being addressed at the state agency level. It might not be well understood on the ground consistently. And so keeping the language in there is really important.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And Mandy just added to the chat a similar sentiment of not wanting to lose it, but adding a note. Thank you, Mandy.
Yeah. So we can clarify kind of where it is in the process, and that statute technically overrides it. All right. All right. I'm going to take that as general consensus and move on. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay. Okay. Right along. Okay, so during the engagement efforts, we heard some challenges related to the name that goes on the business license for in-home care. Some providers have businesses that might include several daycares across different areas, or they might be even in the same neighborhood but spread across different homes. And they express that not being allowed to use the business name on the license has caused some issues when the business owner either loses a provider for some reason and then kind of has to go through the process to get a new license for that home instead of just kind of hiring a replacement provider. But Delk raised some very valid points during the review of the recommendation. So we just wanted to make sure we understand, again, implications on this recommendation and as a group kind of consider how to move forward with this recommendation. So I'll open it up again for discussion. Also, if anyone needs clarity on what that means, happy to provide it. Maybe we start with Delk.
Yeah, is there a new slide or
Oh, yep, sorry.
thank you.
Sorry about that.
Yes, so current fa for family childcare homes, the license is issued in the name of the childcare provider. And while on its surface, this seems like a simple, easy administrative change to, ease some of the I would call them like paperwork, like having like the administrative scramble that occurs when a provider leaves a home and the owner is then found trying to employ a new provider into this home. Um, there are a lot of alternate systems in place, in even nationally, that are connecting to funded sources that are required to be in the name of a provider, right? So there are unintended consequences with this recommendation that need to be explored very deeply before CCLD would be able to make such a switch. For example, the CACFP food program requires that payments be issued in the name of a family childcare provider and not an owner. So that has major implications for that revenue stream. If we were to do that, there may be some impacts in lost revenue for family childcare providers in particular. And we are looking at options. We think that potentially this could, something like this could also benefit CCLD in its administrative processes. However, there is a lot of this work needs to be thought about like extremely carefully and ensuring that we've got all the unintended consequences addressed before we could move forward with anything like this. The other thing I will note is there is a potential, with moving to a business name that needs to be looked at in terms of childcare health and safety, and also how do we maintain compliance records on the individuals versus businesses, right? And so those things would also need to be looked at. So while I definitely agree that there are administrative barriers when an owner owns multiple homes and then they lose a provider which they employ, and now they no longer have an active license at that facility, yet they are still own the business. I think that there may be alternate solutions we can look at to ease some of these administrative burdens and scrambles, rather than taking this path where the business or the owner owns the license. And part of that is because of these unintended consequences that that may impact revenue streams or as well as child health and safety compliance records. And so what I would say to this just in general is that I think it would need to be on its surface it looks good, but I think it needs to be looked at much more deeply in terms of all the factors that on the reasons why the system is set up the way it is.
Can I, um, hi everyone. I have a thought about this particular thing because we saw this in Preschool for All where a woman's provider quit, and what happened is her license was closed. And so, what I'm wondering is there a workaround that looks like there could be the owner could be a substitute? Like, why do you have to close the license completely? She lost her contract because of the license closure. So, could there be something that looks like a substitute provider that could hold that until she got a permanent provider? Because that was a big financial impact for that site. And I've seen these kinds of situations where, like, if you have a childcare center and your director quits, you get to operate with a substitute director while you hire the permanent director. And so there could be a similar kind of process for certified family. That doesn't mean that the certified family has to lose its license, then wait, right? Because it takes a while to get the licensor out, get a new license, all those things. And that could align with center-based practice in a way that isn't so detrimental.
Thanks, Leslie. I agree. Thinking about alternate solutions is potentially the right path forward for this. So we don't lose, CACFP for providers. I think it's a really important revenue stream for us to hold on to. CCLD and DELC is putting forward a legislative concept related to an exception process to the certified statutes, which in turn we hope will address exactly what you're talking about related to getting inspections in place on time, getting an environmental health specialist out on time, especially when there is potential to disrupt care for families. So our hope is within this legislative concept that the CCLD will be able to provide exceptions, temporary waivers to inspection in order to continue care, but also maybe give a 30-day grace period to get out and get those inspections rather than having to get them all in before that facility can operate again. And part of that will be based upon safety, history of the facility, how safe has it been in the past, how clean and sanitary has it been in the past. But we'll be able to do that on a case-by-case basis, and in hopes help ease some of the impacts that you just named.
Alicia, would you be able to provide us with the legislative concept that you're talking about so we can document it?
Yeah, I'll contact you offline and yeah, send you over the talking points for that.
All right. So I again kind of want consensus on what to do with this recommendation as it kind of currently exists. How comfortable are we keeping it and caveating it similar to the other one? Noting that it requires more exploration, which most of these recommendations do, before implementation could occur. So I'll open it up to the group. Who wants to keep it? Who wants to remove it?
Well, or it sounds like there's a third option of adjusting the language to just not spell out the solution, but say that there's a problem that needs a solution.
Yep.
And then that process of finding what the solution is goes back to the appropriate state agency. The other thing I've been thinking about with regard to this one is the purview of this work group is zoning, building code, and permitting processes. And I don't know how this specific recommendations intersects with those charges. So I also think there's a piece about like licensing that is not interacting with those other pieces. I think we should note them and say these are things that came up in the work group, and we have shared them with the Department of Early Learning and Care to determine next steps, but they do not relate to zoning, building code, or permitting, just to be clear about what isn't in the purview of this work group, because we specifically convened this work group with many people in this work group have broad knowledge, as you just heard from Leslie, like really deep, long-standing experience with a variety of things related to early learning and care. And this work group wasn't designed to hold that broad knowledge. And so I don't want us to get too far beyond our statutorily directed scope.
Yeah, I agree because that facility still has a current sanitation inspection. They are, nothing's wrong with the facility in this particular instance. It's the person left, and we're licensing facilities. And so I do agree with Dana's scope on that.
All right. Any other thoughts? I probably need to scoot a little bit for the sake of time. All right. So the next item we'd like to discuss is the recommendation about allowing new providers in an existing lawfully established childcare business without requiring new land use or building approvals. So this essentially would be kind of the term we've always historically used is grandfathering in of a childcare use. So it doesn't need to seek new local permits from planning or building when a business changes ownership. I think from a local government perspective, there's likely a clear path to implementing it, but we did want to see if there was any required change on the sort of licensing procedure side of things. So would DELC need to adopt a similar amendment to its procedures to say that if a business is simply coming into new ownership, they don't need to seek new local or building approvals, since sometimes that Lux form is required. And I think, Leslie, you might have raised this at some point as a recommendation. So if you have any thoughts, please speak up.
Yeah, that is one. I mean, because there are some things I've seen. Again, I've been doing this too long. I've seen folks purchase at long-standing childcare businesses who I've met current fire marshal code, et cetera. And then because it's a new owner, there's a new set of requirements for that person, which doesn't seem to align with our goals of, maintaining the childcare stock we currently have, unless there's going to be, lots of funds to be able to make those updated codes. So I think if it's the same use, it should be allowed if there's a new owner. And that's kind of why I brought this up, because I've seen it happen many times. And it didn't seem to quite make sense because those children would still be there, right, in the same kind of facility, either way.
Brad, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify for building code, it shouldn't be an issue. If it was a legally established use, then just change of ownership, or unless they come in for a permit to change the use to something other than childcare and then want to change it back, then that would be a change of use that would probably implement some new requirements. But an existing legal use shouldn't have to do anything with building code.
Peter.
Yeah, so just echoing Brad's comments and I'll defer to if we have any planners on the call, but typically a land use approval runs with the property. And so again, unless there's a change of use, that shouldn't be an issue for land use approval. And I know there's a lot of subtleties, particularly for the in-home providers, that may be technically a change of use, but at the macro level, it doesn't feel like a barrier.
Angie?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this conversation. As a planner, and as a past county planner, I just want to make sure that I'm flagging the nuances that do come up at the front counter with providers and applicants that come in, particularly with older facilities that have been used for a very long time, like church basements and things like that, where you've had an operator in place for a long time and then something changes or a couple of years go by, right? And you have a new person coming to the front counter saying they'd like to start this business, and there's no record on file with the planning department that that use was established, even though it maybe had been part of that facility for a very long time. And it there has been some conversation on the DLCD side of things about this one in particular, because it seems like the Lux process for a new license holder to operate in an existing facility that's been there for a very long time seems to be tripping up some providers as they try to navigate opening up their business in the same facility that it's been for a very long time. And I appreciate fully that it's a mechanism to ensure safety standards are being met for kids. But it is something to be cognizant of, that if it's grandfathered to a date that to a time that predates land use approvals being required for this, they may have to go through that conditional use permit process from scratch. And if that facility is older, they're likely to have to make improvements that they weren't anticipating, even though that use may have existed in a less formal way from a land use perspective for a very long time. So I hope that helps add some context, and I'd love to hear from the work group what that might mean and what the recommendation should be going forward.
Yeah. And that was not the kind of example I've seen. Like, not people like reopening something. This was just like the kids are still there, the license is still current, the ownership has changed. And then where that usually has happened is people above or below grade, like that's been existed, and that for new facilities they can't do that. And so I know of some center owners that have wanted to sell to another childcare business and can't do that because they would lose classrooms. And so they're actually stuck, because in one point, when that rule changed, which has been many, many years ago, it said that if the ownership changed, that they could not have that grandfathered rule anymore. And I don't know if that's in the licensing guide anymore, but that's how it lived. And so people kind of would lose quite a bit of childcare real estate inside their buildings or for that particular rule.
And then I think the key question with this one was whether there was anything kind of on the DELC side that was needed. Alicia, I saw you come on.
There is nothing needed from the DELC side. We just want to ensure that they can operate there, particularly for centers, with the approvals. And so as long as they are approved, then there's nothing additional on our end when there is an owner change on that front.
Can I ask a quick question, just a clarification on this one? This is just occurred to me. So when facilities are, I think it's what, an annual inspection for relicensing, is there a life safety component of that inspection, or is it primarily sanitation and other operational questions?
The fire marshal is a part of that.
Yeah, so egress paths and things like that.
Yes.
So it's surprising to me to hear that there could be older facilities that are, quote, grandfathered in that wouldn't fundamentally meet current life safety requirements and get recertified. That's a little concerning.
I hear you too, Peter, and I'm thinking the same thing along like the business pieces of that and how that's working and what's slowing down and what's able. I definitely think that's a conversation we're going to need to continue to have when we're looking at infrastructure expansion. We're looking at providing renovations. I'm new to my role. I started in January. I hear Leslie talking about the business pieces of it. So yeah, I'm just as confused as you, Peter.
Typically what happens is when that fire marshal comes in and it's a new fire marshal, that's they're interpreting things very differently than the last one. And I've seen people ask for all kinds of really expensive things, and buildings have been shut down because of that. And they're like, well, we've been operating this way the whole time. Even without a change of owner, we've seen those things happen. And so there needs to be some alignment because these things are very costly and harmful to those businesses and those children that have to leave for whatever reason. And I've seen it multiple times.
Yeah, this is Chad Hawkins. I serve as the Assistant Chief Deputy State Fire Marshal, and I could probably provide some clarity to the conversation. So, um, there's initial application inspections that some agencies have written rules that require a fire and life safety inspection. The caveat to that is that's not an actual requirement in the fire code, nor is it in the statute covered by the State Fire Marshal's Office for R3s under 5. So, the fact that it has been done over the last, I would say, numerous years is because in statute, it requires the State Fire Marshal's Office to establish a training program for ombudsmen, licensors, and whatnot to basically identify fire and life safety issues. But if you have less than 5, specifically, again, in R3s, that you don't need an initial inspection and you also don't need a reinspection. What initiates an inspection is if that ombudsman licensor or whatnot goes to a residence for a sanitation evaluation, whatever it may be, and sees a window that is screwed shut or some very, I would say, large scale fire and life safety issue, then they could reach out to the local fire marshal or one of my deputy state fire marshals and we go do an inspection. The caveat to all that is all jurisdictions within the state of Oregon, there's 304 fire departments, they can all choose to adopt a more stringent fire code standard. And so with that, you look at the 6 major agencies, I would say that we consider exempt jurisdictions being Portland, Eugene, Springfield, Medford, Jackson County 3, City of Salem, Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue. They may adopt a more stringent fire code standard than set by the state. And when they do that, they are obligated to enforce those standards because it may be more particular to their area or they identify another need that they think is pertinent to adopt into the code that wasn't adopted at the state level. So consistency is paramount, but as you can imagine, 304 agencies across the state of Oregon, a lot of fire marshals out there. We in the fire marshal's office here at the state level have 32, and those augment the 304 fire departments across the state because not all of them have fire marshals. I will say, a lot of volunteer combination agencies, not really robust. So we're operating more in the rural setting, but I would say consistency is one of our goals as always. But yes, we do go into a lot of facilities and see things that probably have been missed or not pointed out over the years, and we always work with them to address those. But as far as shutting down an operation, that's a very strong statement because in my 10 years with the state fire marshal, I've only declared 6 dangerous buildings across the state that have actually shut down, and none of them were childcare facilities. So I would be interested to see where those other childcare facilities were and in which jurisdictions.
Yeah, losing classrooms can shut a business down. So it's not necessarily that the entire facility was deemed unsafe, but if you lose multiple classrooms, your revenue is impacted and you may have to shut down. And that's kind of more what I was referring to.
All right. I want to be mindful of time, but these are important things. So thank you for engaging. So we'll move on to the next one. We've been discussing the recommendation here in bullet 3, establish state agency coordination agreements between DLCD and DELC and other agencies involved that do not already have agreements. This one especially, we wanted to get to provide some clarification on as well. It received several votes during the prioritization exercise during the last meeting, but we wanted to come back to it and make sure that we all had an understanding of what a state agency coordination agreement is and what its potential for moving this work forward looks like. So this recommendation, I think, initially evolved from simply being a continuation of this work group after the project ends and kind of has become a little bit narrower in scope in its current form. So we'd like to discuss how we might be able to reword this one to make sure we're kind of all on the same page about its intent and its purpose. So Angie, I'd like to put you on the spot to help us kind of interpret what it means as written.
Sure, and I appreciate this one being flagged because we want to make sure this is what the work group actually intended. Because I think the conversation, and forgive me if you just said part of this, Leanna, I think the conversation stemmed from suggestions that there was a gosh, I'm blanking on the term, something akin to the regional solutions team or some other kind of coming together of the state agencies and departments to make sure that we're all coordinated on almost like a project by project basis. And where I may be the guilty one that suggested this as language for the strategies, but I want to make sure that it's clear what it actually means. As a state agency coordination agreement is an agreement between the two departments that sort of dictates how we work together from a rulemaking perspective or from major projects that trigger certain agreed upon coordination efforts. But it wouldn't be a very helpful tool on an application by application basis where if there was a specific issue that cropped up in one jurisdiction and they needed the state departments to come together and kind of work it out and figure out what was needed, the agreements probably wouldn't be the tool. We would do that anyways, probably as state departments and coordinating with each other. But the formal process of pulling together a state agency coordination agreement has more to do with major efforts from department to department and coordinating to make sure that our rules are not in conflict with each other. And I don't think that's a bad suggestion. I think it's actually a great one. I just want to make sure that we're accomplishing the goal of the original conversations and addressing the need at hand. So I'm not necessarily suggesting removing this. I just want to make sure that we're not missing the need that may have been raised by the work group more specifically.
Yeah, Angie, I'll just add in a little bit before we open up to the group. There have been a few recommendations about how all or a subset of the players can continue to organize and coordinate going forward. And so I just want to offer a few. One is what we have listed here, which are the coordination agreements between state agencies to clarify roles and responsibilities and how sister agencies operate together. A more expanded view could be essentially a continuation of this work group or something like it, to have players at different levels of government and also from different perspectives continue to meet to help move through issues as they arise. And then a third option, even more sort of robust, is what Angie described, which would be sort of a organ solutions kind of convener to really have some power to determine the solutions for steps going forward. And I think what we're trying to ask is there a preferred language that the work group wants to put forward in order to make sure we're uplifting your thoughts on how coordination works going forward?
I'll also just draw attention to the end of the report where we did sort of like as a next step, because this recommendation changed over time, and we thought it was really important to like have that sort of like next step, like, oh, a work group, this has been working really well. We housed it in the next step section at the end of the report as a recommendation, sort of broadly, to continue working as a work group, as these things might come up for implementation. So that piece is technically in the report, just not a recommendation in the matrix.
So the question before you all is, should we leave the recommendation as is, referring to the coordination agreements, or should we expand it in the recommendations as well as in the end of the report?
Kate, you see Dana's comment?
I mean, I don't, I think we could have all three. I think the third recommendation would be a very significant lift. And so that I think the work group would need to consider whether the juice was worth the squeeze. But that again, that's a work group question to discuss.
Because the third option really would be kind of creating a new body of people across agencies that also have sort of authority to make decisions about things, correct? Yeah. Feels.
Just because it's so quiet, I don't think there's any harm in keeping all three and just seeing what the legislature does with that information, since these will just be recommendations and, group think carried forward.
All right, so we'll make it all three. Okay, can we move on to the last one? All right. Hopefully this one's quick. We made an edit to the recommendation that reads permit childcare centers by right in residential zones to add the word urban highlighted there in orange. So it's now, permit childcare centers by right in urban residential zones. And we mostly just for this meeting wanted to make sure that that change was okay with the work group, and maybe DLCD can provide, some context as to what types of zones are then maybe left out by adding that word urban, and if that's okay with the work group.
Yeah, I may put Kelly on the spot if she wants to speak to this.
I'm happy to. Yeah, so in Oregon land use speak, urban and rural refers to urban is inside an urban growth boundary. And then so what this change would do would say that our recommendations permit childcare centers by right only within the urban growth boundaries, and there are residential zones outside of urban growth boundaries that are rural residential, and mostly those are served by wells and septic, so they kind of have a very different infrastructure kind of context, I guess. But because centers are more intensive use, I think we had been thinking that this recommendation applied in urban zones, but we weren't explicit about that. So we just wanted to add that clarifying terminology in there. And there is no, like in Oregon, there is no such thing as suburban. It's all urban or rural. So if you're thinking suburban, it's probably urban. So it encompasses all of that.
So are there any concerns from the work group by clarifying this and just leaving it to urban residential zones?
Leanne, it looks like Petra had a question about UGB fringe agreements.
Yeah. Petra, do you want to expand on?
Yeah, thanks. We're in a strike right now, so I'm running around the office and listening. So I'll keep my camera off. But there seems to be a third category, land use category, because we have urban growth fringe agreements with the respective cities as a county. So that might be a third category about how the city and the counties work together in the urban growth boundary, but outside the city limits.
Would urban and urban fringe residential zones solve that issue, or does it give more confusion?
For me, it's a question. I'm sorry, Kelly. For me, it's a question as opposed to, a suggestion.
I might suggest that I think by saying urban. It just means it's in an urban growth boundary and it's a residential zone. So if a city and a county have a specific agreement about how they treat lands inside an urban growth boundary, I think they can kind of make, I think I think if there are residential zones within that, usually that they create a zone that's like a holding zone, that is a temporary holding zone until a property becomes like annexed into a city and urbanized. So I don't, I guess I would suggest just keeping it to this language of just the word urban, just to avoid confusion, especially because not all counties have fringe agreements, and there's different terminology for that. And so I think it would add to confusion if we started to add more words to this.
Deanna? Um, I I think I don't know enough in order to be able to make a clear recommendation, and I don't want to like leave out. I'm worried about leaving out rural residential zones without making sure we hear from providers that are operating in rural residential zones and whether they've faced these challenges. Like a couple that are coming to mind are like the one that this isn't maybe this issue specifically, but the one that we've heard about that wanted to convert a home next door to her center into an infant toddler care space, but ran into a sewer upgrade, even though the age group that she was caring for was not going to be using the toilet. And there's also a micro center conversation underway right now in a separate parallel work group, that because one of the things that we run into in rural is you might want a childcare that's only serving 20 children, but then you have to find like a commercial building and you have to meet the center requirements, which are, even though you're only serving maybe you're only serving 16 children, but you're still having to meet that center and so I just am worried about narrowing ourselves in without fully understanding the implications of that narrowing. I guess I also wonder if it's a like concern that's not grounded in reality. Like if you're in a rural area, you're not going to be opening like 100-kid center because is my assumption, because there wouldn't be like a child need for that many childcare spots or a sustainability. Yeah.
So can I comment on that for a sec? My understanding was this was adding to, not limiting, because was it 3109 that allowed them by right in rural areas? If I misunderstood that, then my apologies. So number one, this felt like an expansion of the allowed by right. Number two, your thoughts on childcare in rural areas. So we've actually worked with a lot of migrant farm worker family communities. And so Head Start actually operates a number of large facilities in pretty rural areas. So just something to think about and be aware of. We've done facilities for like 200 kids. Now, granted, these are technically within UGBs, I think, in almost all cases, but there actually is quite a big need in agricultural areas for childcare. Thank you.
I can just chime in quickly and say that there is a big difference between urban and rural zoning obligations and allowances, as we've discussed in meetings past. But just to pile onto what Peter just shared, the statute that dictates what kinds of childcare facilities can occur in resource zones, which is the exclusive farm use zone and the forest zones. The exclusive farm use zone specifically allows for childcare centers and qualifying buildings or facilities, and it has a number of criteria that need to be met, but it does allow for them. I think the question we are having right now about urban is, I agree, was intended to be an expansion on existing language for centers, because the existing language in 329A 440 talks about in-home childcare facilities being allowed by right in residential zones. And this is for centers specifically. And so we were wanting to make sure that it was urban, that we understood, or we wanted to make sure that we all collectively agreed that it's intended to be centers in urban residential zones as opposed to rural residential zones, which would be outside UGBs. And part of the question there is really that it's been raised already, that just access to city services, right? Like ensuring you have a sewer connection or a water line connection or fire and emergency response provisions that are provided to incorporated areas of the community. I do think there is a difference between, so the fringe area question's intriguing, and I apologize for rambling a tad bit here, but hypothetically, an urban zone will not occur in the fringe areas unless it has gone through the UGB expansion process and incorporation process and has been removed from any holding zone designations to be urbanized at that point. So I plugged a little bit in the chat to sort of add context to this, but I think the question at hand is, there's maybe two separate questions. The issue that Dana raised about the rural needs being met, and then also the text on the screen about centers in urban residential zones.
I guess so. For example, in sitting on the Childcare Infrastructure Fund, one of the applications that we read was an application from a person who hoped to renovate a home on a large property in a small town. And so this is where I'm like, I don't know if that is in my mind, it is rural. I don't know if it is technically a rural residential zone. It is a very small town in Central Oregon. And they hoped to convert the home into a small childcare center, like 3 or 4 classrooms inside this home. And so this is where I'm just like, I don't know. From a zoning land use, like I'm sure that community needs childcare because currently they have 0 licensed childcare and they could probably use more than 16 spots.
Jennifer?
I would say that I have 3 counties and all of them are rural. And we have a great need for childcare still. The only concern, if we're looking at childcare centers, is are they looking at building a childcare center? And if so, in a residential zone, is there anything in place saying do a needs assessment? Because we've had 2 centers built in 2 of my counties. One of them put registered family and certified families out of business. They promised wide range of hours for shift workers. And then they decided, no, we're going to go ahead and just frame it to the regular, 7:30 to 6 o'clock. And then when the families went back to try to go back to their old providers, there was nothing there because the providers had to close their doors because they didn't have, you know, any children. The other one was very successful because the city and the planning commission, the zoning, they did a needs assessment and it was needed. And they have over 200 kids in the center in that rural community. So, if there is a childcare center going into even a urban or a rural area, just to have them, is there something in place saying, can we do a needs assessment? Can we see what is needed? A recommendation, something like that, because we do have a lot of rural areas that have children that need childcare and could open a center that could host 100 to 200 kids outside of the Head Starts, outside of the OCDCs.
So I think we should probably decide what we want to do.
Right.
I
So
think we're
one option is because it feels like we're going back and forth. Um, we could say permit childcare centers by right in residential zones, period. Consider implications for rural residential zones. So that it highlights that there may be different issues in urban zones, residential zones versus rural residential zones, but doesn't take a stand on what the outcome should be. Does that feel like a way to move forward? I'm seeing some head nods, but if anybody has issues with that, please let us know and we'll consider something different.
I think it's a good step for now. On Monday, um, some of us are meeting with Representative Marsh to discuss what legislative language might actually look like related to this recommendation. And so it's just one that we'll need more clarity on, I think, sooner rather than later.
all right. I think we should move on. Cadence.
All right, folks, we've blown the agenda, and that is okay because this was really a very important conversation, and we really appreciate your input because Echo Northwest could write a whole bunch of words. You've seen us do that a lot, but we want to make sure they're the right emphasis and capture enough nuance so that the when the baton gets passed, that it can be picked up. And so thank you for that time. So we're going to move on now to what priority recommendations we want to uplift in the report. All the recommendations that we've been clarifying are in the report, but what are the tops that we want to consider? And can you do the next slide? Thanks. So right now we have 7 listed. 7 does not have to be the magic number. And so we want to spend a little time with you all considering if there are others we would like to add. We could also remove a couple if you'd like. But what I'd like to do is just show that on the left of the slide, right, are the recommendations themselves, and on the right is sort of the totaling of the votes. So you'll remember at our last meeting, we sliced and diced the questions a little bit, right? What do we want to think uplift that have the most impact for populations such as BIPOC providers or in rural areas? What are the most efficient? What is some other kind of ways to consider what is most impactful, what is most important? And so on the right is sort of the aggregation of what got the most votes total. And you can see that one was the top winner, right? But then we have others that received several votes. And so we felt pretty strongly that it made sense that those ones could be included. But if you go to the next slide, please. You can start to see that there are a few more that also received several votes that were not included. Yeah, thank you, Leanne. 4.4, 5.1, and 3.3 that could also be included if we wanted to. And then I just want to scan down to how the voting kept going throughout. So if you could go to the next slide, and we can come back and look at these more closely. I just want to give you all a scan of our options. And so then you can see starting with 3.1, we're starting to taper off in the number of total votes. That doesn't mean they're not important, but they didn't kind of rise to the top. And then to the next slide, please. And then there were some other recommendations that we wanted you to think about. So these first 3 are the additional ones that got high scores, sort of the 8, 9, and 10, if you will. And then there were some that didn't receive a lot of scores, but we wanted to highlight just for you to think about before we discount them. And when we were thinking about the different ways we were supposed to view potential solutions. Just because something gets 36 votes, obviously that's an important thing statewide, but there may be something that got fewer votes, but will have particular impact on a certain group of providers. And so these are the ones we wanted to highlight for you all. 1.2 was develop and issue official guidance for implementing ORS 215-283, which is the Child Care Centers and Resource Zones and home occupations to encourage consistent approach, right? When we've talked a lot in this group about how inconsistent approach can really lead to bad outcomes. And then 4.2, reducing the time and cost of the permitting process for child care providers. We thought that would be particularly helpful in rural zones and wanted to just highlight that as another one that could be considered as a high priority option. And then finally, this one didn't receive any votes, but we thought it was important, and it has been embedded throughout our conversations, which is essentially providing funding for local governments to translate materials related to the permitting process, right? We acknowledge that DELC does a really good job in translation of materials and how helpful that can be. Other organizations don't necessarily have the capacity to do that on their own, and could resources be made available in order to do that in alignment with their language access policies and priority languages in their communities. So I wanted to pause here for a minute and see if folks have thoughts about sort of the 7 that are currently prioritized in the draft agreement. If you think that one or more of these should be added, we don't need to add any. And I feel like we could add probably, I mean, 10 seems like a sort of natural way, and maybe that's just my Dave Letterman days, but top 10 seems like a reasonable approach if we wanted to go that direction. And of course, if you feel strongly about some or all of these, we can flex as you prefer. And so I'll stop for a minute, but I would like to say that we would like to get some buy-in or consensus thumbs up about adding recommendations to the priority list, so that we can be clear what the will of the group is.
I just like clarity a little bit on the 6.6. I mean, I understand the materials being in those languages, but if someone doesn't speak that person's language at all, there, just the paper is going to have to be put back in English again. I mean, it doesn't go far enough if we're really trying to talk about equity. So that's probably why I didn't vote for that, because it needs to have more to it than just these pieces of paper or these materials are in that person's language. It can't just be that, is what I'm trying to say. And it's
Right.
not
So
helpful to do that for someone and then it has to be put back in English. You know what I mean? It's not
yeah.
enough. So that's why I didn't vote for that. But I understand the spirit of what we're trying to say, but I don't think it's super helpful.
Yeah, so Leslie, would you say that to make it more robust, you would say not just materials, but forms, and then also make interpretation services available?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Do you think that would be helpful?
I would say from folks that I have worked with, it would be. I mean, it's not just enough to do that little bit. It has to go further than that.
Yeah. Do other folks have thoughts about 6.6? Fernanda?
Yes, I agree with Leslie that I'm a native Spanish speaker. I understand English very well, but I go in the shoes of somebody that will struggle with language. Most of the times, we have the option to offer other language for the rules or understanding, but then you go through the rest of the process and it's not accessible. So then you're still stuck in the middle. And sometimes like you read the rules, but then you get in the website for the form and the form is not translated, or the meetings coming to that, or whoever visits you to make all the details don't speak the language. So there's a lot of barriers related to that. And I faced that like every time, even if I speak the language is so technical that even in my native language, it will be hard. So it's just like adding the struggle of understanding another language adds another level of difficulty.
Yep, thank you for that. So in the chat, I have sort of off the cuff provided some alternative language. Mackenzie and Leanne would wordsmith it appropriately. But I would like for you all to take a look at that. And if you think it's something that should be added to sort of the prioritization list, thumbs it up. Or if there's other conversation you want to have around that, please
I,
let us know. Mhm.
I would just say too, because of the technical nature of this work, right? Like interpreters can't just go in and interpret anything, right? Like there are often interpreters who are very specific to special education meetings because there's a whole set of special education terminology and norms and societal stereotypes and cultural differences that are really nuanced. That's not just about knowing what the word is, but it's really understanding that whole context. And so, um, anyway, there's a lot here in terms of building a cadre of interpreters who would have a specific knowledge
Yeah.
base and context to be able to navigate. Like, it's hard for me to, as a native English speaker, and all of these meetings are happening in English, it's very hard for me to understand a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, we've encountered that too. When I worked at a local jurisdiction, it was necessary to have interpreters who were familiar with the development process in order to be effective. And so this would be a similar kind of case, I would imagine. Okay. So, why don't we open it up to just to go in a little bit of some order. Let's talk about the top three, 4.4, 5.1, and 3.3. Does anybody have thoughts about these and have a desire for them to be included in sort of the top priority list? Does anybody have any questions about them that you would like some clarification about? Okay, Dana has strong support for 4.4. And I don't know if you all saw it when I was flashing by really quickly in the previous, I think it was several of the top seven or a couple of the top seven also got 10 votes. So it would be a natural one to include. Kurt.
Thank you. I may be getting ahead because we're talking about priorities, and my comment may be more about implementation. But as I read these, I'm saying some of these items are things that I would expect state agencies have the authority to implement now. Some are going to require some rulemaking, and some are going to require statutory or legislative intervention, like funding allocations. And it seems to me that those different ways of how these can get implemented ought to be kind of factored into the format here. Some of the things that are relatively low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term, shouldn't be dropped from the list because they're worth doing, and they should be relatively easy, relative being the key word there, to incorporate.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the recommendations generally are organized by sort of who would be who has the power and authority and responsibility for doing the thing, right? Is it a recommendation for a statutory change that goes to the legislature? Is it a state agency change? Here we're really talking about, and from a work group perspective, what are the ones that we would like those respective folks to think about first and most? 3.3 is the one we already discussed. Uh, yeah, so Exactly. So it's already happening. So do we need to even include that in the prioritization list because it's the one that's underway already? So maybe don't include that in the, unless we want to have one in our high priority that we can remark is successful before it even makes its way to the legislature. But it definitely could be one that doesn't make the list because it's already in process. Any other thoughts about the top three? Right now, we have a strong support for 4.4, which also got 10 votes, along with, I think, a couple of the others in the top seven. Does anybody have a strong opposition to including 4.4? Okay. No opposition. Thanks, Chelsea. Um, okay, why don't we move to recommendations to help address rural disparities? Does anybody have some strong feelings or thoughts about whether adding 1.2 and 4.2 to the top priority list makes some sense?
Yeah, so I think that 1.2 is super important. I think that this is something that is an easy development. I think that it would make a lot of sense. And what I hear in rural communities and living in a rural community is that it just doesn't happen as often. So when, you know, people are going to guidance, they aren't getting clear information. And so if we had that information out to all of the rural communities, I think that would greatly help address the disparities. And so even though there's, not a lot of votes, I think that one's super important for rural disparities.
Yeah. And I'll just point out that this is one of the places where sort of number of votes doesn't necessarily mean amount of impact. It just might not have a broad impact. And so I appreciate your comment, Rihanna. Okay, so Gail says that they would support including 1.2 and 4.2, but are curious about what Hillary thinks about them. Is Hillary here?
And Hillary Foote is DLCD's farm forest specialist. And I was thinking along the same lines, though I would support including the recommendation as a priority.
I would just add for the discussion that we did confer with Hillary Foote early on in drafts of this language. And she's supportive of clarifying existing statute, right? And that's that's related to the work that she's doing in some rulemaking to clarify other farm forest regulations that apply to new development across the landscape. So she's supportive of clarifying and a consistent approach, and did flag for us in our internal discussions that many of the home occupation permitting requirements applied at the local level stem from local preferences and local ordinances. And so there is opportunity in some instances to streamline or reduce regulations at the local level that might not be required by state law. So she did express concerns with going beyond clarification and the other recommendations about making childcare uses permitted outright in resource zones would require additional conversation and future rulemaking and other work to address more fully. But thank you for raising that, Gail.
Okay, so then 5.1 was established state agency coordination agreements between DLCD and DELC. Remember, we had a whole bunch of conversation and triplets came from that one, right? Where we decided we were going to add not just the coordination agreements, but also continuation of the work group, and then also this idea of sort of a more robust decision-making body, joint decision-making body. In my mind is sort of like akin to the HAPO or business organ, some other kind of forum for that. I think my question for you all is, do any of those need to be in our top priority recommendations? Or are we happy just to have them be part of the general body of recommendations we have. No thoughts. Okay, that's fair. So reading the room as best I can, I think we've got a couple ones that to add, or at least to consider adding. And this is where I would like you all to do a thumbs up, thumbs down in the chat. There you go. Are you interested in adding 4.4, 1.2, 4.2, and 6.6 to the priority recommendations? I mean, can we do thumbs down? I probably checked that. I assume that we can. Let's see. Yeah, you can. It appears that I am not much of a thumbs downer kind of person. Okay, that's great. Thank you, folks. Keep them coming. Um, is there anyone who wants to say anything about the priority recommendations before we sort of conclude this part of the discussion?
I had one question. It's kind of a housekeeping question on the initial priority 7. So I'm not sure. Is that what you're looking for feedback on right now?
Well, go ahead.
Okay.
If you can scooch back to the
Me-
first 7, please.
Yeah, that'd be great. It's really just a housekeeping question. Um, if we're looking at drum roll, those first 7.
Mackenzie or Leanne, can you get us back to the slide with the top 7? There you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are fantastic. In general, it to me, like, are 1 and 7 kind of the same document? It feels like it's like a part A and a part B.
Well, one is for jurisdictions and one is for childcare providers. So uh, I would imagine they would be different, but not hopefully contradictory.
Yeah. So maybe it's like I was just thinking for efficiency. Again, it's kind of a housekeeping question, really. I mean, I don't know that I'm adding anything to the conversation, but I just was curious if that was, like the whoever's generating those packets can do them both at the same time with a consistent terminology. There's almost like a third document that's terminology for both, so everybody's speaking the same language, literally.
Yeah.
I could see some efficiency in that, approaching it that way. So
Yeah,
that's really it.
thank you, Peter. Yeah, I also had a similar question. And so we've kind of gone around and around internally about that. And I think all of the comments make sense. They're clearly connected. I also agree that one needs to come first, right? The more technical, nuanced, like how are we going to do this, people? Guidance, and then a more legible and from the perspective of a prospective provider document. And yeah, there should be some synergy in the compilation of that information so that we can ensure that it's consistent in its approach.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments about the top 11 that we have now? Okay. All right, let's move on then to the next part of our conversation. So we just wanted to make sure that we took a breath and really thought about, okay, do we feel we've done what we set out to do, right? So we were supposed to take a look at information and research from all over the place, obviously here in Oregon, but nationally, about how zoning and building codes and permitting practices either inhibit or support new childcare facilities being established here. And so we had a whole memo on sort of the state of the world, and then next slide. Then we were also supposed to provide a report, right, about how to reduce the barriers and support expansion. I guess a little bit of a note on the 5 cities and counties in the who are your work group members. There are specific recommendations being provided. They are from the total of the recommendations that we've developed together, but tailored for those areas. We're supposed to look at statewide, and your participation has helped us do that. And the question of should we offer legislative changes? And there are several that are legislative changes as well as administrative changes. And importantly, right, we're supposed to try and reduce disproportionate racial and regional disparities. And so that was part of the reason why we wanted to uplift these other items for consideration with regard to English language learners as well as folks in rural parts of the state. And so I think one of the things we wanted to do is when you take a look at all of the requirements in the statute, do you all feel like we have done that? If you go to the next slide, please, there's a few specific questions that we wanted to uplift here to give you a chance to think about and talk about, to make sure that in your minds, together, we have done what the legislature charged us with doing. So do you feel like the draft report addresses the requirements outlined in the bill? Are there parts of the report that need clarification from what you've read thus far in order to reflect your understanding of the issues and the priority recommendations? And are there anything critical aspects that need to be added or emphasized in order to strengthen this report?
I just added my one outstanding because I think earlier it was said that childcare centers are allowed in EFU zones with certain conditions. And I was like, I thought they weren't. So I just pulled up that statute, which I know I've looked at before, specifically for childcare. And the certain exceptions are pretty, like, that's a pretty significant exception if it's only allowed if you're co-located with a community center or a school. And so I didn't want that to go unnoted because that's that means they're really not allowed most places.
Yeah, and so we have a recommendation 1.4. And so this is, I guess, for in-home care in residences and resource zones. So it wouldn't apply to centers, but it would apply to in-home. Is that?
The recommendation that, let's see, this 1.2 is, it sort of addresses home occupation, so in-home, and then it also addresses childcare centers in resource zones. You're right. I think there are extreme limitations to how it's allowed, but I think this one is about kind of getting clarity on that regulation, because I think it's worded a little funky, and Angie can speak to that a little bit more. But yes, I think our understanding is that it does have to be sort of narrowly co-located with community centers or schools.
I am guilty of having to look at my phone for a second while you were while you called me out. You're talking about the resource zones specifically, correct?
Yes. Her question's in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, my son's school texted. Only childcare centers co-located care or school, is that right? So the language, thank you for plugging a link into the chat. The language is very specific. There's only a couple of types of facilities that would qualify for that use. That is how we interpret it. And I'll pull it up here. And I would just acknowledge that there are 3 other members of the DLCD team on this call, including Gordon Howard, if anybody wants to speak to this more specifically than I can. But let me scroll down to it here really quick and just read it for you all. Childcare facilities, preschool recorded programs, or school-aged recorded programs that are authorized under the ORS 329A 250. They have to be authorized under that statute, and they have to be primarily for the children of residents and workers of the rural area in which the facility or program is located, and they have to be co-located with a community center or a public or private school allowed under this subsection. So it's a very limited path, if you will, for what kinds of childcare facilities can occur and where they can occur. But it is a path that is available currently.
And then for this recommendation in 1.2, it sounds like there is some confusion between how that provision and the home occupation provision interact.
The home occupations are currently the only permitted pathway for in-home childcare facilities to occur in resource zones, the exclusive farm use zone and any forest zones. They're typically the path used in most jurisdictions currently, although I think this could be an interesting discussion for in-home childcare providers in rural residential zones, even though we know that ORS 329A 440 seems to indicate that that may not necessarily be a requirement of state law. So the difference here is home occupations are the only way to have an in-home permitted childcare facility in rural landscapes, and centers are only permitted as we just read through ORS 215, 283 2DT in those farm and forest zones. I hope that is responsive to the question. Sorry again for being distracted for a second.
It is, and I hear about this exclusive farm use zone challenge a lot. Just was on an email thread with someone in Wallowa County that was like, there's like literally zero. I drive 2 hours every day so that my child can be in childcare, so that I can work. So I just want to raise that. I think from a childcare provider perspective, but not understanding all the implications, like there may be an interest in going beyond better understanding the existing statute. I don't know why we would start at 5 years old to say that kind of care is allowed, but we would not start before 5 years old. I think it's too late to like open up a brand new recommendation. I don't know if there's a way to kind of nuance this 1.2 without saying we recommend a change in the statute, because I don't think we're there on this last day with like 15 minutes left. But maybe just further exploration.
I think from what I've heard from this work group and others as a past county planner, I think there's a lot of interest in obviously in clarifying how the current system works, the current rules work, and so we're all being consistent across the state in how we apply it, but also whether or not it's meeting the need, right? I feel like that's what we've heard through these discussions, is that path may not be meeting the need on rural landscapes, and perhaps that's something for the future, the next phase of this work to do a little deeper dive into. And
I wonder if that, 1.2 could be develop official guidance, blah, 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 and explore whether change in these requirements could be, beneficial to rural communities or something.
I defer to the work group for that call, and I'm going to stop talking because we do have DLCD members, Patrick and Lee, in the room that may have additional thoughts, and I should keep more quiet, facilitator.
All right. Well, thanks, Angie. I agree with Dana. I do. But I will say there is there are many groups that would have concerns over expanding any of the 50 plus some would consider conflicting uses that are already allowed in the EFU zones. I'm not particularly part of that camp, but I do support certainly conserving the farmland that we have and not introducing uses that would conflict with the importance of the integrity of our agricultural zones. I think we can do both. And I like Dana's point, and I would support, Angie's comment to integrate. Are these allowances currently under the statutes meeting the need, or are they serving the rural communities as intended, or can we do both? Can we balance the need to protect and preserve and improve our agricultural commodities while still, because earlier in the meeting we heard, I think from Peter, if I'm not mistaken, about how we do see this need in our agricultural communities sometimes pronounced. So I like this, even at the 11th hour, I like this conversation very much. And those are my thoughts. Thanks.
So
can I add one just follow-up comment? Thank you, Patrick. So as important as this issue is, and I hope this is taken in the spirit of just constructive conversation, but I almost don't feel like this group, like myself included, that we're qualified to address this point. This is a fundamental land use question that I just don't know. I don't feel qualified to make that call. I honestly don't. And I've done work, I've done due diligence in EFUs all around the state. And I kind of want to, for me personally, I would defer to comp planners to make this kind of call. So that's just my 2 cents, and I'm just speaking for myself. So I hope I didn't offend anybody by saying that.
thank you, Peter. So in the chat, I posted a potential sort of second sentence to add to 1.2, which reads, explore changes to these requirements to expand access to childcare in rural settings. Again, this doesn't prescribe a solution. It just highlights an issue. If folks like that concept, if you could do thumbs up, if you think that we should leave it as is, and just know that folks who will be implementing that recommendation, if it moves forward, will also want to do a deeper dive into the larger complexities of rural childcare. That is another option for us. Yeah, and Lee's pointing out the tensions, right? If people can live and work in a rural area, what are we going to do with their children? Right. It's tricky. Okay, so right now we've got 4 thumbs up. That does not feel like enough to make a significant change to the recommendation.
I mean, is there any dissent to the explore language?
Good question.
Okay, unpopular opinion here, I guess. I'm gonna say it. We have a real crisis in the real rural communities, especially the agricultural communities here in Oregon. And if we don't explore, right, then we are sentencing young children and families with young children to unsafe situations. I just, as we were talking this morning, had a provider out in rural Oregon, in central rural Oregon, who is called while we were on the phone, Child Protective Services, to report children who were left home alone this morning while their parent went to go work in an agricultural setting. Three young children, an infant, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old. Because the parent right now is struggling, doesn't have, is on the wait list, in ERDC wait list, can't afford to bring the child to childcare every day. And they have a childcare provider. Can you imagine if there were no children in care? Kids would be left home by themselves, sleeping. God only knows if those kids were dosed to continue to sleep in the morning. Because, let's face it, 10:30 in the morning is kind of late to have a child still sleeping, especially an infant. And so, this is very real, folks. I'm doing the House Bill 4086 work group, and people are telling stories and sharing experiences about cases where people are leaving their kids home alone. And is that really neglect? If there's no childcare, is that really neglect? Because what do people do? Here's the thing, right? If we aren't willing to explore it, I think that's pretty sad. That's very sad if we are not really willing to explore it. And we're saying we're gonna prioritize a building and zoning over the lives of children, over the real, very real lives of children. That's just, in my opinion, that is grossly negligent. And so if we aren't willing to explore, we are sentencing children to all sorts of unsafe situations, because if there's no childcare, then there's no care.
Yeah. Thank you, Annalise. So I'm going to take it that you're doing a thumbs up for explore.
Yeah, I put up my thumb up, but it goes away pretty quick, right? When you react. Yeah, I think I was the first one that put my thumb up.
Got it. All
And
right.
we've got to do something here in Oregon around and these parents that come and talk at House Bill 4086. One of the things they talk about, right, is we've got one, I think she's down like in Crook County, and she says, I can't find childcare. And then I have providers like in Lane County, right, who have a building. It's been used as a childcare for decades. And one individual that works for Lane County puts a whole monkey in the wrench and has disrupted care for, I don't know, a dozen families. This kind of stuff is not right. It doesn't feel right. And I understand that we want to keep kids safe, but how do you keep kids safe if they can't even, if they're staying home alone? How do you keep kids safe? They're alone.
Right. So Annalise, thank you for uplifting sort of the needs of our children in this discussion. And I think we've been trying to figure out what is that balance point of as Alicia says, right? We need to make sure that there are some rules in place to make sure that kids are provided care and safe environments, and we need to make sure that there are enough safe environments to take care of our kids. And it's not an either or, it's a both and it's one of those things that we've been struggling with, on top of the fact that we have laws and land use regulations and ways of doing buildings, right? That are also kind of complicating how we go about doing this tricky business of something that should be essentially an obvious right of children to have a safe place to be cared for.
So I think, exploration needs to occur, and just because you've done something historically for 50 years even doesn't mean that it's right, doesn't mean that it works. I mean, they used to stone people in the Bible. We don't do that anymore. People evolve, society evolves. There's recognition that we can change. So explore. For goodness sakes, exploration doesn't guarantee that we're going to make any changes, right? It's a very soft touch. Yeah, let's explore it.
All right, Peter, real quick, and then I would
Real
like
quick,
to. Oh,
real quick. I just want to respond to that just because I went on the record saying, hey, I wanted to defer some of this to other folks with more expertise in land use. I just think fundamentally, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Annalise. I think I just want to, this entire process is a massive, huge signal to, legislators, to providers, to everyone involved in creating childcare opportunities that this is one giant exploration already. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a huge signal that goes into the system saying this matters and we care about these issues deeply. So I just wanted to frame that. My comment was simply that when we're talking about balancing resource use at the state level, those are big, big decisions about big chunks of land. And I just think we need additional expertise when we're talking about work that's already underway. That's all.
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Peter. We know, I think we all are understanding that all of us here are trying to serve children better and know that you're not trying to keep that from happening just because the complexities of the land use system are huge and the implications are big. The good news is we do not have to implement every single recommendation by the end of the year. We just need to make recommendations by the end of the year. And so lots of smart people are going to be thinking about all of these things and uplifting the need to really pay very close attention to what is happening in our rural communities is a big deal. So we have 3 minutes. Dana and Lindsay wanted to have a couple minutes to talk, and I would like to give you sort of literally 2 minutes to talk because we would also like to give everyone else on the team a chance to have some last words.
I'll be really quick. I already mentioned earlier in the call that a handful of us are meeting with Representative Marsh. She was the drafter of House Bill 2727, and she's really interested to hear where the recommendations are landing. And she has a placeholder bill that she's looking to fill with our top recommendations that require or would benefit from statutory change. And so one big next step coming out of this process is to identify what those are in partnership with Representative Marsh and ask her to carry those recommendations forward to the legislature so that further discussion and debate that needs to happen in a statutory change process can happen. Well, simultaneously, we know, to Annalise's point, like it doesn't just take, zoning, building code, and permitting process improvements to expand childcare. It also takes funding for our childcare subsidy program. It also takes workforce pathways so that we can staff these childcare programs, and it takes funding through programs like the Childcare Infrastructure Fund and the Co-location of Affordable Housing Fund to expand access to affordable quality care in our state. And so advocacy partners are working to build a package that will be carrying forward to the 2025 legislative session. And this piece will be a part of that package. And it's been lovely to work with and learn from all of you. I've really appreciated the facilitation and the expertise on the group.
Awesome. Thank you, Dana. That's exciting. I mean, because, sometimes as a work group, you're like, okay, we just worked really hard, and is this going to go anywhere except someone's shelf to gather dust? So it is lovely to know that there's real interest at the legislature to move forward on this. Lindsay, are you still here?
She had to pop off for another meeting, but I'm happy to share updates if you need me to.
That would be great.
So Delk is obviously working with Business Oregon on the Childcare Infrastructure Fund, and round one is officially ended as of September 30th. The Childcare Infrastructure Fund had opened on August 15th, and the initial round was for $10 million. Business Oregon received over 738 applications that totaled nearly $289 million in requests. So they have received they have received all the applications except for from two counties, which were Wheeler and Baker. They will make award announcements on December 2nd, and the funds will be dispersed in January of 2025. They will be awarding projects in 28 different counties, and applications for round two will be open early 2025 and will be a $15 million round. And for round one with the property acquisition, they had 148 applications for that. With major renovations and new construction, they had 112 applications. For minor repairs, they had 378 applications. And with planning, they had 100 applications.
Boom.
So a lot of infrastructure, y'all.
Yeah. Thanks, Whitney. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just great. We know that money can't solve everything, but it does also help a lot of things. So this is good news. So folks, it's 11:01. I wish we had more time for last words and thoughts. I'll open the space just for a minute to see if anyone wants to say anything. Before we go, I do want to say thank you so much for your continued participation, for your willingness to stick with us today, going through some of the nitty-gritty. Really very much appreciate your contributions. And anyone else want to say some last words?
I'll just reiterate my earlier thanks. This has been an incredible work group, and I'm really proud of the outcome that we've arrived at together, and I'm looking forward to being able to share it with the legislature. Um, I don't know if you've already said this yet or not, Cadence, about final input or feedback on the report. There's a deadline coming up. We want to make sure we capture everything and get it right before it goes off for our legislature's consideration. But thank you again. This has been it's an incredible experience, and I've learned so much. And just the melding of the minds from all the different professions and the perspectives on this single issue has just been an honor to be part of it. So thank you. It's been great.
Yep. And on that note, all edits in, please, by November 22nd. Please email them to us. We would appreciate your feedback. And then we'll get it going, finalizing so that it's into the legislature before the deadline. Thank you so much, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Bye.
good day.
Thanks all.